Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the world of Greek Gods Explained. Let's not wait any longer and get this story started. In the beginning, when the world was nothing more than swirling chaos and endless void, there emerged from the primordial darkness a pantheon of beings so magnificent and complex that their stories would echo through millennia, shaping the very foundations of Western civilization and continuing to captivate minds long after their temples fell silent. The Greek gods, those immortal figures who ruled from the peaks of Mount Olympus and wandered through mortal realms, represent far more than mere mythological curiosities. They embody the deepest human experiences, our greatest fears, our most passionate desires, and our eternal quest to understand the forces that govern our existence. To truly comprehend these divine beings, we must first journey back to that primordial time when chaos reigned supreme, a time before time itself had meaning, when the universe existed as an empty, gaping void without form or substance. From this chaos came Gaia, the Earth Mother, whose very essence became the solid ground beneath our feet, the mountains that pierce the sky, and the fertile soil from which all life springs forth. She was not merely a goddess, but the living embodiment of our planet, breathing and pulsing with an ancient wisdom that predates all other divine consciousness. Gaia, in her infinite creativity and perhaps her loneliness, gave birth to Uranus, the sky, who stretched his starry expanse across her earthly form like a cosmic blanket. Their union created the first generation of divine beings, the Titans, massive and powerful entities who would rule the cosmos long before Zeus and his siblings claimed their thrones. These Titans were not the refined, human-like deities we often imagine when we think of Greek gods, but rather primordial forces of nature incarnate, beings of such immense power that their very movements could reshape continents and redirect the flow of rivers. Among these first Titans stood Cronus, whose name has become synonymous with time itself, though his story reveals him to be far more complex than a simple personification of temporal flow. Cronus possessed a terrible hunger for power that would ultimately define not only his own fate, but the entire trajectory of divine succession. When he learned from his parents that one of his own children would overthrow him just as he had overthrown his father Uranus, Cronus made a decision that would haunt him forever. He began to devour each of his children the moment they were born, swallowing them whole in a desperate attempt to forestall his prophesied doom. His wife Rhea, herself a Titaness of great power and cunning, watched in horror as Cronus consumed their offspring one by one. When her youngest son Zeus was born, she could bear it no longer. In a moment of maternal desperation and divine cleverness, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to her husband, who, in his paranoid haste, swallowed it without question, believing he had once again thwarted fate. Meanwhile, the real Zeus was spirited away to a cave on the island of Crete, where he was raised in secret by nymphs and fed on the milk of the divine goat Amalthea. As Zeus grew to maturity, hidden from his father's terrible gaze, he developed not only tremendous physical strength, but also a strategic mind that would serve him well in the battles to come. The young god understood that brute force alone would not be sufficient to defeat Cronus and the other Titans who ruled the cosmos. He would need allies, cunning, and perhaps most importantly, he would need to free his siblings from their prison within their father's stomach. When Zeus finally confronted Cronus, he carried with him a special potion prepared by the wise Titaness Medes, a mixture that would force the older god to regurgitate all that he had consumed. The battle that followed shook the very foundations of reality. Cronus, upon drinking the potion, indeed vomited up Zeus's siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, each emerging fully grown and eager for revenge against their cannibalistic father. What ensued was the Titanomachy, a war between the younger gods and the older titans that raged for 10 years, with battles so fierce that they caused earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and storms that threatened to tear apart the newly formed world. Zeus proved himself not only a formidable warrior, but also a brilliant strategist. He understood that victory would require more than just the strength of his siblings. He descended into the depths of Tartarus, that hellish pit beneath even the underworld, and there he found the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who had been imprisoned by Cronus for their dangerous knowledge of crafting divine weapons. In exchange for their freedom, the Cyclopes forged for Zeus his famous thunderbolts, weapons of such devastating power that they could shatter mountains and split the sky itself. But Zeus's masterstroke was his liberation of the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants whose very appearance was so terrifying that even the Titans feared them. These ancient beings, grateful for their freedom after eons of imprisonment, joined Zeus's cause and tipped the balance of the war decisively in favor of the younger gods. When the dust finally settled and the last echoes of divine combat faded away, the Titans lay defeated, cast into the depths of Tartarus, where they would remain imprisoned for eternity, guarded by the very Hecatoncheires who had helped secure Zeus's victory. With the old order overthrown, Zeus and his siblings found themselves the new rulers of a cosmos that needed to be reorganized and governed. Rather than rule as a single omnipotent deity, Zeus divided the realms among his brothers, keeping the sky and the upper world for himself, while granting Poseidon dominion over the seas and all the waters of the earth, and giving Hades rule over the underworld and the realm of the dead. This division would prove to be both wise and problematic, as each brother would develop his own distinct personality, preferences, and methods of rule that sometimes brought them into conflict with one another. Zeus, as king of the gods, established his court on Mount Olympus, that towering peak in northern Greece whose summit disappeared into the clouds and seemed to touch the very heavens themselves. Olympus became more than just a residence. It was a symbol of divine authority, a place where the gods could gather to feast, debate, and make the decisions that would shape the mortal world below. The mountain itself seemed to respond to the divine presence, its peaks always shrouded in ethereal mists, its slopes home to creatures and plants that existed nowhere else on Earth. But Zeus was not content to rule alone, and his romantic entanglements would become legendary, creating a complex web of relationships that would populate Olympus with a diverse array of deities, each with their own domains, personalities, and stories. His marriage to Hera, his sister and the goddess of marriage and family, was both a political alliance and a passionate union, though it would be marked by constant conflict due to Zeus's numerous infidelities and Hera's jealous responses to them. Hera herself deserves far more recognition than she often receives in modern retellings of Greek mythology. She was not merely a jealous wife, but a powerful goddess in her own right, the protector of marriage as a sacred institution, and the guardian of women during childbirth. Her anger at Zeus's affairs was not simply personal jealousy, but righteous indignation at the violation of the very principles she was sworn to uphold. When Zeus would disguise himself as various animals or humans to seduce mortal women, he was not just being unfaithful to his wife. He was undermining the entire concept of marriage that Hera embodied and protected. The children of Zeus, born from his various unions, both divine and mortal, would come to populate the Olympian pantheon and extend divine influence into every aspect of human experience. Athena, perhaps the most remarkable of his offspring, sprang fully grown and fully armed from Zeus's own head, a birth so unusual that it required the god Hephaestus to split Zeus's skull with an axe to allow her to emerge. This strange birth gave Athena a unique position among the gods. She was not born of woman, but directly from the mind of Zeus, making her in many ways his most trusted advisor, and the goddess most closely associated with wisdom and strategic thinking. Athena's wisdom was not the abstract philosophical wisdom of later thinkers, but practical intelligence, the kind of cunning that could devise solutions to complex problems and see through deception to truth. She became the patron goddess of Athens, that great city-state that would become the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, and her influence on the development of Greek civilization cannot be overstated. The Athenians built her the magnificent Parthenon, a temple so perfect in its proportions and so beautiful in its execution that it still stands today as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. Apollo, another of Zeus's children, represented a different aspect of divine influence on human affairs. Born to the Titaness Leto after she wandered the earth seeking a place to give birth, for jealous Hera had forbidden any land from harboring Zeus's pregnant lover, Apollo emerged as a god of many talents and domains. He was the god of music, poetry, and the arts, inspiring mortals to create beauty that could touch the divine. His lyre, crafted by his clever half-brother Hermes, could produce melodies so beautiful that wild beasts would lie down peacefully to listen, and even the stones would arrange themselves into walls when he played. But Apollo was also the god of prophecy and truth, speaking through his oracle at Delphi, where mortals from across the Greek world would come seeking glimpses of their future. The oracle of Delphi, always a woman chosen for her sensitivity to divine inspiration, would enter a trance state and speak Apollo's words, though often in cryptic phrases that required careful interpretation. This aspect of Apollo reveals something profound about the Greek understanding of truth. It was not something that could be grasped directly or easily, but required wisdom, patience, and often a willingness to accept uncomfortable realities. Apollo's twin sister Artemis represented the wild, untamed aspects of nature that Apollo's civilizing influence sought to order and harmonize. She was the goddess of the hunt, the moon, and virginity, choosing to remain forever unmarried and surrounding herself with a band of nymphs who shared her commitment to chastity. Artemis roamed the forests and mountains with her silver bow, hunting not for sport, but to maintain the balance of nature, culling herds when they grew too large, and protecting young animals from unnecessary suffering. The relationship between Apollo and Artemis reflects a fundamental tension in Greek thought between civilization and wilderness, between the ordered world of cities and laws and the wild realm where different rules applied. Their mother Leto had wandered as an outcast before their birth, and perhaps this experience shaped her children's understanding of what it meant to exist on the margins, whether by choice like Artemis or by the demands of divine duty like Apollo. Aphrodite's entrance into the Olympian pantheon tells us much about the Greek understanding of love and beauty. According to some accounts, she was born from the sea foam that formed around the severed genitals of Uranus when Cronus castrated his father, making her one of the oldest divine forces present at the very beginning of the cosmic order. Other stories make her a daughter of Zeus, but either way, her power over both gods and mortals was absolute and often devastating. Aphrodite represented not just romantic love, but the fundamental creative force that drives all life. Her influence extended far beyond simple physical attraction to encompass the deep connections that bind communities together, the inspiration that drives artistic creation, and even the political alliances that were often sealed through strategic marriages. Yet her power was also dangerous, for love could be destructive as well as creative, leading to jealousy, betrayal, and violence. Her marriage to Hephaestus, the craftsman god who was born lame and considered ugly by divine standards, reveals the complex Greek attitude toward beauty and worth. Hephaestus, despite his physical limitations, was essential to Olympian society, forging the weapons and tools that the other gods required. His workshops beneath volcanic mountains produced marvels of craftsmanship that were both beautiful and functional, suggesting that true value came not from appearance but from skill and dedication. Yet Aphrodite's affairs, most notably with Ares, the god of war, created scandals that rocked Olympus and provided endless material for poets and storytellers. The contrast between her gentle husband and her passionate lover Ares highlighted the tension between creation and destruction, between the patient work of building civilization and the violent impulses that could tear it apart in moments. Ares himself was perhaps the most complex and misunderstood of the Olympian gods. Modern interpretations often portray him as a simple-minded brute who glorified violence for its own sake. But the ancient Greeks understood him as embodying the terrible but sometimes necessary reality of warfare. Ares represented not just the bloodlust of battle, but also the courage required to face mortal danger, the solidarity that develops between warriors who trust each other with their lives, and the harsh justice that sometimes could only be achieved through force. The Greeks were not a naturally warlike people, despite their reputation for military prowess. They understood warfare as a sometimes unavoidable evil, something that disrupted the natural order of civilized life, but was occasionally necessary to preserve that order against those who would destroy it. Ares, in this context, was not a god to be worshipped enthusiastically, but rather to be acknowledged and propitiated when circumstances demanded his intervention. Hermes, the messenger god, occupied a unique position in the Olympian hierarchy as the divine intermediary who could move freely between all realms, the heights of Olympus, the mortal world, and even the underworld of Hades. His role as messenger made him privy to the secrets of all the gods, and his quick wit and silver tongue made him an invaluable diplomat when conflicts arose between divine personalities. But Hermes was also the god of thieves, merchants, and travelers, all occupations that required the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances and to see opportunities that others might miss. The stories of Hermes often emphasize his cleverness and resourcefulness, qualities that the Greeks valued highly. On the very day of his birth, he stole Apollo's cattle, demonstrating both audacity and ingenuity that would serve him throughout his divine career. When confronted by his angry half-brother, Hermes didn't deny his theft, but instead offered to make amends by crafting the first lyre from a tortoise shell. This gift so delighted Apollo that he not only forgave the theft, but also traded his cattle for the instrument, recognizing that Hermes had created something far more valuable than what he had stolen. This story illustrates a crucial aspect of Greek values, the belief that intelligence and creativity could transform even wrongdoing into something beneficial for society. Hermes became the patron of merchants not because the Greeks approved of dishonesty in business, but because they understood that successful trade required many of the same skills as successful theft: the ability to assess value quickly, to negotiate effectively, and to take calculated risks. Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and the harvest, perhaps more than any other deity, represented the direct connection between divine will and mortal survival. Her domain was not abstract or symbolic, but immediately practical. She controlled the growth of crops upon which human civilization depended. The story of her daughter Persephone's abduction by Hades and her subsequent grief that caused the first winter reveals the Greeks' understanding of the natural cycles that govern their lives. When Hades, god of the underworld, fell in love with young Persephone as she gathered flowers in a meadow, his solution was direct and brutal. He opened the earth and carried her down to his realm to be his queen. Demeter's response was equally dramatic. She abandoned her duties as goddess of the harvest and wandered the earth in mourning, disguised as an old woman, searching for her lost daughter. Without her attention, crops failed, trees bore no fruit, and famine threatened to destroy all mortal life. The eventual compromise, negotiated by Zeus himself, established the pattern of seasons that would govern human agriculture forever after. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with her husband and part on Earth with her mother. During the months of Persephone's absence, Demeter's grief would cause winter, but her joy at her daughter's return would bring forth spring and summer. This myth provided the Greeks with an explanation for the seasonal cycle, but more importantly, it emphasized the interconnectedness of all life and the price that must sometimes be paid for the continuation of existence. Hades, ruling his underground kingdom, was not evil in the way that modern audiences might expect. He was stern and inexorable, but also just, ensuring that the dead received appropriate treatment based on their conduct during life. His realm was vast and complex, containing not only punishment for the wicked, but also rewards for the virtuous. The Elysian fields provided eternal bliss for heroes and the righteous, while Tartarus contained the torments reserved for those who had committed the most heinous crimes. The underworld that Hades ruled was not simply a place of death, but a necessary part of the cosmic order. Just as Demeter's cycles ensured the renewal of plant life, Hades's domain provided rest for the weary and justice for those who had been wronged in life. The Greeks understood death not as an ending, but as a transformation, a passage from one state of existence to another under the governance of a god who, while fearsome, was ultimately fair. Poseidon, master of the seas, controlled forces that were both life-giving and terrifyingly destructive. The Mediterranean Sea was the highway of Greek civilization, connecting the scattered city-states and enabling trade, communication, and cultural exchange that made Greek achievements possible. But the sea was also unpredictable and dangerous, capable of generating storms that could destroy entire fleets or earthquakes that could level cities in moments. Poseidon's personality reflected this dual nature of his domain. He could be generous to those who honored him properly, granting favorable winds and calm seas to sailors who made appropriate sacrifices. But he was also quick to anger and terrible in his wrath, as demonstrated in the story of Odysseus, who earned the gods' enmity and spent 10 years wandering the sea as punishment for blinding Poseidon's son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. The relationship between Poseidon and mortals was complex and required careful navigation. Coastal cities needed his blessing for their fleets and their prosperity, but they also needed to be prepared for his displeasure. The rituals and sacrifices offered to Poseidon were not just religious observances, but practical insurance policies, attempts to maintain good relations with a force that could make the difference between prosperity and disaster. Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and religious ecstasy, entered the Olympian pantheon under unusual circumstances and brought with him aspects of divine experience that challenged conventional notions of order and rationality. Born from Zeus's thigh after his mother Semele was destroyed by the full glory of Zeus's divine form, Dionysus was twice born and carried within him the wild, irrational forces that civilization sought to control, but could never entirely suppress. The worship of Dionysus involved rituals that deliberately broke down social barriers and conventional behavior. His followers, the Maenads, would abandon their normal lives and roam the mountains in frenzied celebration, tearing apart wild animals with their bare hands and consuming raw flesh in rituals that horrified and fascinated the civilized Greeks. These practices were not simply primitive barbarism, but deliberate attempts to access states of consciousness that everyday life could not provide. Dionysus represented the recognition that human nature contained elements that could not be satisfied by rational thought and orderly behavior alone. His festivals provided sanctioned opportunities for people to experience abandon and ecstasy, while remaining within a religious framework that made such experiences meaningful rather than merely destructive. The theater, one of Greece's greatest cultural innovations, developed from Dionysiac festivals, suggesting that even their most refined artistic achievements grew from acknowledgement of humanity's wilder aspects. The relationships between these gods created a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and dependencies that mirrored the political realities of Greek city-states. Zeus's position as king of the gods was not absolute. It required constant negotiation and compromise with other powerful deities who had their own domains and followers. The stories of divine conflicts and resolutions provided models for human political behavior and explanations for the complex forces that shaped mortal lives. Hestia, often overlooked in modern retellings, was actually one of the most important deities in daily Greek life. As goddess of the hearth, she presided over the sacred fire that burned at the center of every home and every city. This fire was not merely for cooking and warmth, but was a spiritual center that connected the domestic sphere to the divine realm. Every meal began with an offering to Hestia, and her blessing was essential for the stability and prosperity of households and communities. The fact that Hestia chose to remain a virgin and to focus her attention on the domestic sphere rather than the grand adventures that occupied other gods reflects the Greek understanding that civilization depended as much on the quiet maintenance of daily life as on heroic achievements. Without the stability that Hestia provided, the dramatic exploits of other gods would be meaningless, as there would be no human society to benefit from divine intervention. The minor gods and goddesses, the nymphs, satyrs, and other divine beings who populated the Greek mythological landscape, were equally important in understanding how the Greeks perceived the relationship between the divine and natural worlds. Every grove had its dryad, every stream its naiad, every mountain its oread. These lesser deities were not distant, abstract forces, but immediate presences that could be encountered in daily life by those who knew how to look. The nymphs, in particular, represented the Greeks' understanding that nature was not merely a collection of resources to be exploited, but a living community of conscious beings with their own interests and personalities. A farmer who cut down a tree without considering the dryad who lived within it might find his crops failing or his animals sickening. A traveler who polluted a stream might find himself lost in what had previously been familiar territory. This animistic understanding of nature required a fundamentally different relationship with the environment than modern industrial societies typically maintain. Every action had to be considered not only for its immediate practical effects, but also for its impact on the spiritual ecosystem that surrounded and penetrated the physical world. The Greeks developed elaborate protocols for interacting with nature that acknowledged the rights and dignity of its divine inhabitants. The oracle traditions that developed around various gods, but particularly Apollo, represented sophisticated attempts to understand divine will and to make decisions based on more than human knowledge alone. The oracle at Delphi was the most famous, but there were many others throughout the Greek world, each with its own methods of divination and interpretation. These oracles were not fortune tellers in the modern sense, but rather channels through which divine wisdom could be accessed by mortals facing difficult decisions. The cryptic nature of many oracular pronouncements was not a flaw in the system, but an essential feature. It forced those seeking guidance to think deeply about their situations and to consider multiple possible interpretations and outcomes. The process of consulting an oracle was elaborate and expensive, requiring ritual purification, appropriate offerings, and often long journeys to reach the sacred sites. This investment of time, money, and effort ensured that those who sought divine guidance were serious about their questions and prepared to act on the answers they received, even if those answers were not what they had hoped to hear. The festival traditions that developed around different gods created regular opportunities for entire communities to engage with divine forces and to reinforce social bonds through shared religious experience. The Olympic Games, held in honor of Zeus, brought together athletes from across the Greek world in competition that was both sporting contest and religious observance. The dramatic festivals of Dionysus showcased new plays that explored moral and philosophical questions through the lens of mythological stories. These festivals were not simply entertainment, but crucial mechanisms for maintaining cultural coherence across the scattered Greek city-states. They provided opportunities for people to experience their shared identity as Greeks, to learn about developments in art, philosophy, and politics in other regions, and to demonstrate their devotion to the gods who protected and guided their civilization. The mystery religions that developed around certain gods, particularly Demeter and Dionysus, initiated deeper spiritual experiences than the public festivals could provide. These mysteries promised not just divine favor in this life, but also better treatment in the afterlife for those who underwent the secret rituals and learned the hidden teachings. The Eleusinian mysteries, centered on Demeter and Persephone, were the most prestigious and long-lasting of these secret religions. Initiates came from across the Mediterranean world to participate in rituals that reenacted the story of Persephone's abduction and return, providing participants with profound spiritual experiences that they were forbidden to describe to outsiders. These mystery religions acknowledged that ordinary religious observance, while necessary for community cohesion and divine favor, might not satisfy the deepest spiritual longings of all individuals. They provided pathways to more intense religious experience for those who sought them, while maintaining the social stability that depended on shared public rituals. The philosophical schools that developed in later Greek history often maintained complex relationships with traditional religion, neither accepting it uncritically nor rejecting it entirely. Philosophers like Plato found in the myths metaphorical truths about the nature of reality and the human condition, while others like Epicurus argued that the gods existed, but were too perfect and happy to concern themselves with human affairs. This philosophical engagement with mythology demonstrates the sophistication of Greek religious thought. Rather than requiring literal belief in every detail of divine stories, Greek religion encouraged thoughtful engagement with the deeper truths that the myths conveyed. The gods were understood to represent real forces in the world and in human nature, whether or not they existed as literal personalities dwelling on Mount Olympus. The artistic representations of the gods evolved over centuries of Greek culture, reflecting a changing understanding of divine nature and human relationships with the gods. Early archaic sculptures showed gods as powerful but distant figures, while classical art depicted them with idealized human forms that suggested both divine perfection and accessibility to mortal understanding. The development of Greek art was intimately connected with religious practice, as most artistic works were created for temples, festivals, or other religious purposes. The Parthenon sculptures, the painted vases that depicted mythological scenes, and the dramatic masks used in religious theater all served not just aesthetic, but also spiritual functions, helping worshippers connect with divine realities through beauty and skilled craftsmanship. The influence of Greek gods on later cultures extended far beyond the boundaries of ancient Greece itself. As Greek civilization spread through the conquests of Alexander the Great and the cultural exchanges of the Hellenistic period, Greek gods were encountered by other peoples who often identified them with their own deities or adopted them wholesale into their religious systems. The Romans, in particular, created a synthesis of Greek and native Italian religious traditions that preserved many Greek mythological stories while adapting them to Roman values and concerns. Roman versions of Greek gods often emphasized different aspects of their personalities and functions, reflecting the practical, militaristic culture of Rome compared to the more philosophical and artistic culture of Greece. Even after the rise of Christianity led to the official abandonment of pagan religions, the Greek gods continued to influence European culture through literature, art, and philosophy. Renaissance artists and writers rediscovered classical mythology and used it as a source of inspiration for works that explored eternal human themes through the lens of ancient divine stories. The enduring appeal of Greek mythology lies not in its historical accuracy or literal truth, but in its profound psychological and spiritual insights into human nature and the forces that shape our lives. The gods represent archetypal patterns of experience that transcend specific cultural contexts, speaking to universal aspects of the human condition that remain relevant across centuries and civilizations. Zeus's struggles with power and responsibility, Hera's battles with jealousy and betrayal, Apollo's balance between civilization and wildness, Aphrodite's dangerous gifts of love and beauty. These stories continue to resonate because they address fundamental questions about what it means to be human, to live in community with others, and to seek meaning and purpose in an often chaotic and unpredictable world. The psychological depth embedded within these ancient divine narratives reveals itself most clearly when we examine the ways in which the gods embodied human contradictions and paradoxes, never presenting themselves as simple moral exemplars, but rather as complex beings whose very flaws and struggles made them accessible to mortal understanding. This accessibility was not accidental, but reflected a sophisticated theological understanding that divine beings needed to be comprehensible to human experience in order to be meaningful guides and sources of inspiration. Consider the figure of Hephaestus, whose physical disabilities and social awkwardness among the beautiful gods of Olympus made him perhaps the most human-like of all the divine beings. His lameness, caused either by a birth defect or by Zeus hurling him from Olympus in a fit of rage, marked him as different from his perfect relatives, yet his skills as a craftsman made him indispensable to their society. In his forge beneath Mount Etna, Hephaestus created wonders that surpassed anything produced by his more conventionally attractive relatives. Armor that could turn any blade, automatons that could serve at divine banquets, and even golden servant women who could think and speak and assist him in his work. The workshop of Hephaestus represented something profoundly important about the relationship between creativity and suffering, between difference and contribution to society. His physical limitations forced him to develop intellectual and artistic abilities that his more conventionally gifted siblings never needed to cultivate. His marriage to Aphrodite, arranged by Zeus as compensation for his earlier mistreatment, created a union between beauty and craftsmanship that produced some of the most poignant stories in Greek mythology. When Aphrodite's affair with Ares was discovered by Hephaestus through his own ingenious trap, a net so fine it was invisible yet strong enough to hold the two lovers immobile, his response revealed both his pain and his dignity. Rather than responding with violence, he summoned the other gods to witness his humiliation, forcing them to confront the consequences of their indifference to his feelings. Some of the gods laughed, but others recognized the injustice of the situation and the nobility of Hephaestus's restrained response. This story operates on multiple levels of meaning, addressing not only personal relationships, but also broader questions about the nature of value and worth in society. Hephaestus represented the skilled artisan whose work was essential to civilization, but who often received less social recognition than warriors or rulers. His patient craftsmanship contrasted sharply with the impulsive passion that characterized both Aphrodite and Ares, suggesting that lasting accomplishments required different qualities than immediate gratification provided. The cyclical nature of many Greek myths reflected the ancient understanding that life followed patterns of death and renewal, conflict and resolution, separation and reunion. The story of Persephone's annual return from the underworld was only the most obvious example of this cyclical thinking. The myths of Dionysus also emphasized cycles of death and rebirth, as the god was said to have been torn apart by titans and then reassembled, experiencing destruction and renewal in ways that his worshippers could understand and emulate. These cyclical patterns provided comfort to people living in a world where change was constant and often traumatic. Wars, plagues, famines, and natural disasters could destroy entire communities. But the myths suggested that destruction was not final, that renewal was always possible if people maintained their relationships with the divine forces that governed such cycles. The mystery religions, particularly those associated with Demeter and Dionysus, offered initiates personal experiences of death and rebirth that prepared them to face their own mortality with greater equanimity. The relationship between fate and free will, which would become a central concern of later philosophy, was explored extensively in Greek mythology through stories that showed even the gods struggling with limitations on their power. Zeus himself, despite his position as king of the gods, could not simply decree that events should unfold according to his preferences. He was bound by the decisions of the fates, those ancient goddesses who spun, measured, and cut the threads of destiny for gods and mortals alike. The three fates, Clotho, who spun the thread of life, Lachesis, who measured its length, and Atropos, who cut it at the appointed time, represented forces that preceded even the Olympian gods and continued to operate regardless of divine preferences. This limitation on divine power was not seen as a flaw in the cosmic order, but as evidence of its fundamental justice. Even Zeus had to accept that some things were beyond his control, that the universe operated according to principles that transcended individual will, whether divine or mortal. This tension between fate and freedom created the dramatic tension that drives many of the most compelling Greek myths. Heroes like Oedipus struggled against prophetic warnings only to fulfill them through their very attempts at avoidance. Gods like Apollo found themselves bound by their own promises even when they regretted making them. These stories suggested that wisdom lay not in fighting against fate, but in understanding how to work within its constraints to achieve the best possible outcomes. The concept of hubris, excessive pride that led mortals to challenge the gods or overstep the boundaries of their humanity, provided another crucial framework for understanding the relationship between divine and mortal realms. Stories of mortals who claimed to be equal to the gods in beauty, skill, or achievement invariably ended in punishment that served both as justice for the individual and as warning to others who might be tempted to similar pride. Yet these hubris stories were more nuanced than simple morality tales about the dangers of pride. They often involved mortals whose abilities were genuinely exceptional, who had achieved things that seemed to justify their confidence. The weaver Arachne really was skilled enough to create tapestries that rivaled those of Athena herself. The musician Marsyas really could play the flute beautifully enough to challenge Apollo to a contest. Their punishment came not because their claims were false, but because their success had led them to forget the source of their abilities and the proper relationships between mortals and immortals. These stories served multiple social functions, warning against excessive pride while also acknowledging human potential for genuine achievement. They suggested that the highest human accomplishments were always gifts that carried with them responsibilities to honor their divine sources. An artist or craftsman who became too proud of their work risked losing the inspiration that made excellence possible in the first place. The educational function of mythology in Greek society extended far beyond simple moral instruction to encompass practical knowledge about human psychology, social relationships, and natural phenomena. Children learned about the dangers of jealousy through stories of Hera's persecution of Zeus's lovers and their offspring. They learned about the importance of hospitality through tales of gods disguising themselves as travelers and rewarding or punishing mortals based on how they were received. The story of Baucis and Philemon, an elderly couple who welcomed disguised Zeus and Hermes into their humble home when wealthier neighbors turned them away, became a powerful teaching tool about the true nature of virtue and divine favor. When the gods revealed themselves and offered to grant any wish the couple desired, Baucis and Philemon asked only to die at the same time so that neither would have to live without the other. Their wish was granted, and they were transformed into intertwining trees that would stand together for eternity. This story taught that divine favor was not based on wealth or social status, but on character and behavior toward others, especially toward strangers who might be in need. It also provided a beautiful meditation on the nature of love and commitment, showing how human relationships could achieve a kind of immortality through their depth and constancy. The seasonal festivals that punctuated the Greek calendar year provided regular opportunities for communities to engage with different aspects of divine influence and to reinforce social bonds through shared celebration and ritual observance. The Panathenaea, Athens's great festival honoring Athena, involved not only religious ceremonies but also athletic competitions, musical contests, and the presentation of a new robe to the goddess's statue, woven by the city's finest craftswomen over the course of months of careful work. These festivals required enormous community investment of time, resources, and creative energy, but they provided returns that extended far beyond religious observance. They served as showcases for artistic achievement, opportunities for political leaders to demonstrate their devotion to the city's patron deity, and occasions for citizens to experience their membership in a community that extended beyond their immediate families and neighborhoods to encompass the entire polis. The dramatic competitions that formed part of religious festivals gave birth to Greek theater, one of humanity's most influential artistic innovations. The plays performed at the festival of Dionysus in Athens were not entertainment in the modern sense, but religious experiences that used mythological stories to explore profound questions about justice, duty, fate, and human nature. Audiences came not just to be entertained, but to be educated and transformed by encounters with divine truth presented through human artistry. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the three great tragedians whose works survive today, each found different ways to use traditional mythological material to examine contemporary moral and political questions. Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy used the story of Agamemnon's murder and its aftermath to explore the transition from primitive justice based on blood revenge to civilized justice administered by courts and laws. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex used the king's discovery of his true identity to examine the limits of human knowledge and the dangers of excessive confidence in rational analysis. Euripides, often considered the most modern of the three, frequently questioned traditional religious assumptions and presented gods who were morally ambiguous or even petty and vindictive. His Medea showed a woman driven to infanticide by her husband's betrayal, while his Bacchae explored the destructive potential of religious enthusiasm when it became divorced from rational restraint. These plays demonstrated that Greek religion was sophisticated enough to accommodate questioning and criticism, that faith could be strengthened rather than weakened by honest examination of its complexities and contradictions. The mystery religions that developed alongside public worship offered more intensive spiritual experiences for those who sought deeper connection with divine realities. The Eleusinian mysteries, centered on the story of Demeter and Persephone, attracted initiates from across the Mediterranean world who came seeking assurance of favorable treatment in the afterlife and deeper understanding of life's fundamental mysteries. The secrecy that surrounded these mystery religions was not merely exclusivity for its own sake, but recognition that certain spiritual experiences required careful preparation and could not be communicated effectively through ordinary language. Initiates underwent purification rituals, fasting, and other preparatory practices that altered their consciousness and made them receptive to revelations that would be meaningless to unprepared minds. The promise of blessed afterlife offered by the mysteries was not simply reward for participation in secret rituals, but the natural consequence of spiritual transformation achieved through encounter with divine truth. Those who had experienced death and rebirth symbolically in the sacred dramas were prepared to face actual death with confidence that it represented transition rather than termination of their existence. Orphism, another mystery tradition associated with the legendary musician Orpheus, offered a more philosophical approach to religious experience that influenced later developments in Greek thought. Orphic teachings emphasized the divine nature of the human soul and provided practices aimed at purifying the soul of contamination acquired through embodied existence. These ideas would later influence Plato's philosophy, and through him, much of subsequent Western thought about the relationship between soul and body, eternal and temporal existence. The figure of Orpheus himself embodied the power of artistic beauty to transcend ordinary limitations and connect human beings with divine realities. His music was so beautiful that it could charm wild beasts, make stones weep, and even move the gods of the underworld to pity. When his beloved wife Eurydice died from a serpent bite, Orpheus descended to Hades and convinced the Lord of the Dead to release her through the sheer power of his song. The tragic ending of this story, with Orpheus losing Eurydice forever when he looked back at her during their ascent to the upper world despite being warned not to do so, provided a powerful meditation on love, loss, and the limitations of even the greatest human achievements. Orpheus's music could accomplish miracles, but it could not overcome his own all-too-human inability to trust completely in divine promises. His backward glance represented the doubt that destroys faith and the impatience that undermines hope. The mystery traditions recognized that not all people were suited for the same type of religious experience and provided alternatives to the public worship that formed the foundation of community religious life. While everyone participated in the festivals and rituals that honored the city's gods, some individuals sought more intensive spiritual practices that required greater commitment and offered deeper transformation. This diversity of religious expression reflected the sophisticated understanding that human spiritual needs varied according to temperament, circumstances, and individual development. The same divine truths might be apprehended through athletic competition, dramatic performance, philosophical study, artistic creation, or mystical experience, depending on the capacities and inclinations of different worshipers. The philosophical schools that developed during the classical period maintained complex relationships with traditional mythology, neither accepting it uncritically nor rejecting it entirely. Plato found in the myths allegories that conveyed philosophical truths about the nature of reality, the human condition, and the requirements for just society. His famous allegory of the cave, describing prisoners who mistake shadows on the wall for reality itself, echoed mythological themes about the difference between appearance and truth, between the visible world and hidden realities that could only be apprehended through philosophical inquiry. Aristotle, while more skeptical of mythological truth claims, recognized that myths served important social functions and contained psychological insights that rational analysis could extract and examine. His Poetics analyzed Greek tragedy as a form of knowledge that provided understanding of human nature and moral principles through emotional engagement with fictional characters and situations. The Stoic philosophers, who became influential throughout the later ancient world, found in traditional myths examples of the philosophical principles they advocated. They interpreted stories of gods and heroes as allegories about the proper relationships between reason and emotion, individual will and cosmic order, acceptance and resistance to circumstances beyond human control. Epicurus, founder of another major philosophical school, argued that the gods existed as perfect beings who experienced only pleasure and were therefore uninterested in human affairs. This interpretation preserved divine existence while eliminating anxiety about divine punishment or favoritism, creating space for human beings to pursue happiness through rational pleasure and friendship, without fear of supernatural interference. These philosophical interpretations of mythology demonstrated the flexibility and richness of Greek religious thought. Rather than requiring literal belief in every detail of mythological stories, Greek culture encouraged thoughtful engagement with the deeper truths that myths conveyed. The same stories could provide entertainment for children, moral guidance for ordinary citizens, and profound philosophical insights for sophisticated thinkers. The artistic representations of gods that adorned temples, public buildings, and private homes served not just decorative functions, but also educational and inspirational purposes. The Parthenon sculptures showed Athena's birth from Zeus's head in her contest, with Poseidon for patronage of Athens, reminding citizens of their special relationship with the goddess of wisdom and their responsibility to live up to her expectations. Vase paintings depicted scenes from mythology that reinforced cultural values and provided models for behavior in various circumstances. A young man preparing for military service might study images of Achilles receiving his armor from his mother Thetis, learning about the proper relationships between honor, duty, and mortality that should guide his conduct in battle. The development of increasingly naturalistic representation in Greek art paralleled the evolving understanding of the relationship between divine and human nature. Early archaic sculptures showed gods as powerful but remote figures whose expressions revealed little of their inner states. Classical art depicted deities with idealized human forms that suggested both divine perfection and emotional accessibility to mortal understanding. The famous statue of Zeus at Olympia, created by the sculptor Phidias and considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, reportedly inspired religious awe in all who saw it. Visitors described feeling that they had actually encountered the god himself, not merely viewed an artistic representation. This suggests that Greek religious art succeeded in its primary purpose of making divine realities present and accessible to worshippers through skilled human craftsmanship. The influence of Greek mythology on later European culture extended far beyond scholarly study of ancient texts to encompass living traditions of artistic and literary creativity that continued to find inspiration in classical themes. Renaissance artists rediscovered mythological subjects as sources of beauty and meaning that could speak to contemporary concerns, while connecting their work to the most prestigious traditions of Western culture. Botticelli's Birth of Venus transformed the ancient story of Aphrodite's emergence from sea foam into a celebration of divine beauty that reflected both classical ideals and Christian mystical traditions. Michelangelo's sculptures of gods and heroes combined technical mastery learned from ancient examples with emotional intensity that spoke to Renaissance concerns about human dignity and creative potential. The survival of mythological themes through centuries of Christian dominance demonstrates their power to address universal human experiences that transcend specific religious or cultural contexts. The stories of divine love, jealousy, creativity, and justice speak to aspects of human nature that remain constant across historical periods, while their artistic treatment can be adapted to reflect the values and concerns of different eras. Modern psychological theory has found in Greek mythology rich sources of insight into the structures and dynamics of human personality and social relationships. Carl Jung's concept of archetypes drew heavily on mythological figures as representatives of universal patterns that shape individual and collective human experience. The anima and animus, the shadow, the wise old man, and the great mother are psychological realities that Jung found reflected in divine personalities from various mythological systems. Freud's analysis of the Oedipus complex used a Greek mythological story to illuminate fundamental dynamics of family relationships and personality development that he believed operated in all human societies. While modern psychology has moved beyond Freud's specific theories, the recognition that myths contain profound insights into human nature continues to influence therapeutic practice and personality theory. The enduring power of these ancient stories lies not in their historical accuracy or literal truth, but in their ability to illuminate persistent questions about human existence that each generation must answer anew. What does it mean to live a good life? How should we understand the relationship between individual desires and social responsibilities? What attitude should we take toward mortality, suffering, and the limitations of human knowledge and power? Greek mythology provided a framework for thinking about these questions that acknowledged their complexity, while offering guidance based on centuries of collective human experience. The gods, with their own struggles and limitations, served as accessible models for grappling with divine and human realities that could never be fully understood, but had to be engaged with courage, wisdom, and hope. The festival traditions that celebrated different gods throughout the year created rhythms of community life that integrated religious observance with social celebration, artistic performance, and economic activity. The Dionysiac festivals that gave birth to Greek drama also provided opportunities for wine merchants, food vendors, and craft workers to profit from the crowds that gathered for religious observance. The Olympic Games combined athletic competition with religious ceremony and commercial activity that brought together people from across the Greek world. These festivals demonstrated that Greek religion was not separated from ordinary life, but woven into all aspects of human activity. Religious observance enhanced rather than competed with other forms of human flourishing, creating communities where spiritual, artistic, athletic, and economic achievements could all be appreciated as expressions of human excellence guided by divine inspiration. The oracle traditions that developed around various gods represented sophisticated attempts to access divine wisdom for guidance in making important decisions. The oracle at Delphi, Apollo's most famous prophetic shrine, attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean world who came seeking divine guidance on matters ranging from personal relationships to military strategy and colonial expansion. The cryptic nature of many oracular pronouncements was not a flaw in the system, but an essential feature that forced those seeking guidance to think deeply about their situations and consider multiple possible interpretations and outcomes. The famous response to Croesus, king of Lydia, who was told that if he attacked Persia he would destroy a great empire, exemplified this ambiguity. The oracle was correct, but the empire destroyed was his own rather than his enemies'. This ambiguity served multiple functions. It protected the oracle's reputation while acknowledging the inherent uncertainty of future events. It forced those seeking guidance to take responsibility for their own decisions rather than simply following divine commands. And it recognized that wisdom often involved understanding the limitations of knowledge rather than claiming certainty about unknowable matters. The integration of philosophical inquiry with religious practice that characterized later Greek culture demonstrated the sophistication of ancient approaches to spiritual questions. Rather than seeing reason and faith as opposed, Greek thinkers generally understood philosophical inquiry as a pathway to deeper religious understanding, a way of approaching divine truth through human intellectual faculties that were themselves gifts from the gods. This integration produced some of the most influential works in Western intellectual history, from Plato's dialogues that used mythological imagery to explore philosophical concepts, to Aristotle's systematic analyses of natural phenomena that sought to understand the rational principles governing divine creation. The marriage of reason and revelation that characterized medieval Christian thought owed much to Greek precedents that had already worked out sophisticated relationships between intellectual inquiry and religious commitment. The mystery religions that flourished throughout the ancient Mediterranean world offered direct personal experience of divine realities that complemented rather than competed with the intellectual approaches of philosophy. These traditions recognized that not all important truths could be communicated through rational discourse, that some aspects of divine reality could only be apprehended through carefully structured ritual experiences that engaged the whole person, body, emotion, imagination, and spirit in a transformative encounter with sacred power. The promise of personal salvation offered by mystery religions addressed human needs that public worship and philosophical inquiry could not fully satisfy. While community festivals reinforced social bonds and philosophical study provided intellectual satisfaction, the mysteries offered individual transformation and assurance of meaningful existence beyond the limitations of mortal life. The psychological transformation offered by the mystery religions reflected a sophisticated understanding of human consciousness that recognized the existence of deeper layers of awareness beneath ordinary waking experience. The ritual procedures used to induce altered states of consciousness, fasting, sleep deprivation, sensory overwhelm or deprivation, rhythmic movement, and consumption of psychoactive substances were carefully calibrated to break down normal ego boundaries and allow initiates to experience unity with divine forces that were always present but usually hidden from ordinary awareness. The Eleusinian mysteries, which persisted for nearly 2,000 years and attracted initiates including Cicero, Plato, and Marcus Aurelius, used the myth of Demeter and Persephone as a framework for ritual experiences that promised participants direct knowledge of life after death. The sacred drama that formed the climax of the initiation ceremony apparently involved visual, auditory, and perhaps chemical elements that produced profound altered states of consciousness in which initiates experienced their own death and rebirth symbolically. The secrecy that surrounded these experiences was not merely exclusivity for its own sake, but recognition that the states of consciousness induced by the rituals could not be adequately described in ordinary language and might be misunderstood or trivialized by those who had not undergone the necessary preparation. The transformation that initiates experienced was understood to be permanent, fundamentally altering their relationship to mortality and their understanding of their place in the cosmic order. Modern scholars have debated the precise nature of the Eleusinian experience, with some suggesting that the sacred drink consumed by initiates contained ergot alkaloids that produced visions similar to those induced by LSD. Whether or not psychoactive substances were involved, the consistent testimony of initiates across centuries suggests that the mysteries provided genuinely transformative experiences that addressed the deepest human fears about mortality and meaninglessness. The agricultural metaphors that permeated the Eleusinian mysteries, death as the planting of a seed, rebirth as the sprouting of new life, the cyclical nature of growth, harvest, dormancy, and renewal, provided initiates with a framework for understanding their own mortality that was both psychologically comforting and agriculturally relevant to people whose survival depended on successful farming. The promise was not an escape from the natural order, but deeper understanding of one's place within cycles of death and renewal that governed all life. The Dionysiac mysteries, while sharing with Eleusis the theme of death and rebirth, emphasized the ecstatic transcendence of ordinary consciousness through direct encounter with divine madness. Dionysus himself was understood to be a god who had experienced death and resurrection, having been torn apart by Titans as a child and subsequently reassembled by Zeus. His worshippers sought to share in this experience of dismemberment and reintegration through ritual practices that deliberately induced states of consciousness radically different from normal awareness. The Maenads, female followers of Dionysus, who abandoned their conventional social roles to roam mountains in frenzied celebration, represented the deliberate cultivation of altered consciousness as a pathway to divine knowledge. Their practices, tearing apart animals and consuming raw flesh, engaging in frenzied dancing that continued for hours or days, experiencing visions and prophecy, were designed to break down the boundaries between human and divine consciousness. These practices horrified many conventional Greeks, who saw them as dangerous threats to social order and rational thought. The tension between Dionysiac religion and conventional society is explored in Euripides' play The Bacchae, which shows the terrible consequences that follow when a community attempts to suppress the gods' worship entirely. The play suggests that the wild, irrational forces that Dionysus represented could not be simply eliminated from human nature, but had to be acknowledged and given appropriate expression within carefully structured religious contexts. The cult of Orpheus offered a more philosophical approach to mystery religion that emphasized the purification of the soul through knowledge rather than ecstatic experience. Orphic teachings included elaborate cosmological myths that described the origin of the universe, the nature of the human soul, and the requirements for achieving blessed existence after death. These teachings were preserved in texts buried with initiates, providing them with guidance for navigating the challenges they would face in the underworld. The Orphic understanding of the soul as divine, but contaminated by embodied existence, influenced later Platonic philosophy and early Christian thought about the relationship between spirit and matter. Orphic practices aimed at purifying the soul through ethical behavior, ritual observance, and study of sacred texts that revealed the true nature of reality hidden beneath the illusions of ordinary perception. The diversity of mystery traditions available in the ancient world reflected recognition that different people had different spiritual needs and capacities. Some were drawn to the agricultural symbolism and communal aspects of the Eleusinian mysteries, others to the ecstatic individualism of Dionysiac religion, still others to the philosophical sophistication of Orphic teachings. This diversity prevented any single approach from claiming exclusive access to divine truth, while ensuring that various temperaments and circumstances could find appropriate pathways to spiritual fulfillment. The relationship between mystery religions and public worship was generally complementary rather than competitive. Initiates in mystery cults typically continued to participate in civic religious festivals and to honor the gods of their cities and families. The mysteries provided additional layers of religious experience rather than alternatives to conventional practice, deepening rather than replacing traditional religious commitment. This integration of esoteric and exoteric religious practices created a rich and complex spiritual landscape that could accommodate both popular devotion and sophisticated theological reflection. The same individuals might participate in community festivals honoring Athena or Apollo, while also seeking initiation into mystery cults that promised more intimate divine encounters and deeper understanding of cosmic realities. The philosophical schools that developed during the Hellenistic period, after Alexander's conquests, created systematic approaches to living well that drew on mythological wisdom, while subjecting it to rational analysis. The Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics, and cynics each developed distinctive interpretations of traditional religious teachings that sought to provide practical guidance for achieving happiness and virtue in an increasingly complex and cosmopolitan world. Stoicism, perhaps the most influential of these schools, taught that the universe was governed by divine reason that manifested itself through natural law and providential care for all creation. The Stoic sage sought to align his will with divine will by accepting whatever circumstances arose while maintaining inner freedom through rational understanding of cosmic necessity. Traditional myths were interpreted as allegories about the proper relationship between human reason and cosmic order. The Stoic interpretation of Zeus as the cosmic reason governing all events provided a framework for understanding suffering and injustice that preserved divine goodness while acknowledging the reality of human pain. What appeared to be evil from a limited human perspective was understood to be part of a larger pattern that served the good of the whole, even when individual parts suffered. This teaching provided comfort to people facing circumstances beyond their control, while encouraging active virtue in areas where choice was possible. Epicureanism offered a very different approach to religious questions, teaching that the gods existed as perfect beings who experienced only pleasure and were therefore uninterested in human affairs. This eliminated anxiety about divine punishment while preserving respect for divine excellence as a model for human aspiration. Epicureans sought to achieve happiness through rational pleasure, friendship, and freedom from the fears and desires that disturbed mental tranquility. The Epicurean approach to mythology was primarily therapeutic, using traditional stories to illustrate philosophical points about the sources of human suffering and the requirements for achieving lasting satisfaction. The gods served as examples of beings who had achieved perfect happiness through the elimination of want and fear, providing models for human ethical development while remaining too perfect to be concerned with human prayers or offerings. Skepticism, as developed by philosophers like Pyrrho and Sextus Empiricus, questioned the possibility of achieving certain knowledge about divine realities while maintaining a practical attitude of religious observance. Skeptics argued that since the nature of the gods could not be determined through rational investigation, the wise person should suspend judgment about theological questions while continuing to participate in traditional religious practices as expressions of cultural membership and social responsibility. This skeptical approach anticipated many modern discussions about the relationship between religious belief and practice, recognizing that religious commitment might be justified on grounds other than metaphysical certainty about divine existence. The skeptical philosopher could participate in religious festivals and honor traditional gods while maintaining intellectual honesty about the limitations of human knowledge regarding ultimate realities. Cynicism, founded by Diogenes of Sinope, represented the most radical critique of conventional religious and social values, though it remained deeply influenced by mythological themes and examples. Cynics sought to achieve virtue and happiness through the elimination of conventional desires and social pretensions, living according to nature rather than human custom. They often used mythological figures like Heracles as examples of virtue, achieved through struggle and indifference to conventional rewards. The Cynic critique of conventional religion focused not on the existence of gods, but on the corrupting effects of elaborate rituals and expensive offerings that diverted attention from genuine virtue. Diogenes taught that the gods needed nothing from humans and were best honored through ethical behavior rather than ritual observance. This position influenced later Christian critiques of pagan religion while preserving respect for divine reality. The synthesis of Greek philosophical and religious traditions with other cultural influences that occurred during the Hellenistic period created new forms of religious expression that would profoundly influence the development of later Western civilization. The encounter between Greek thought and Egyptian, Persian, Jewish, and other traditions produced syncretic religious movements that combined elements from multiple sources while maintaining recognizable connections to their various origins. The cult of Isis, originally an Egyptian goddess who became popular throughout the Roman world, incorporated Greek mythological themes and philosophical concepts while preserving distinctively Egyptian ritual practices and theological concepts. Isis was understood as a universal mother goddess who combined the functions of numerous Greek deities while offering a more personal and emotionally satisfying relationship with divine power than traditional Olympic religion typically provided. The appeal of Isis and other foreign deities to Greek and Roman audiences reflected changing religious needs in an increasingly cosmopolitan world, where traditional civic religions could no longer provide adequate meaning and identity for people whose horizons extended far beyond their local communities. These universal deities offered membership in cosmic communities that transcended ethnic and political boundaries, while providing the personal attention and care that the great Olympic gods often seemed to lack. Neoplatonism, the philosophical movement initiated by Plotinus in the 3rd century CE, created a sophisticated synthesis of Platonic philosophy with religious mysticism that profoundly influenced later Christian, Islamic, and Jewish thought. Neoplatonists found in traditional mythology allegorical representations of metaphysical realities that could be approached through philosophical contemplation and mystical practice. The Neoplatonic understanding of the gods as manifestations of the One, the ultimate reality from which all existence emanates, provided a framework for integrating polytheistic religious practice with monotheistic philosophical theology. Different gods represented different aspects or levels of divine reality, all ultimately unified in the transcendent source from which they proceeded and to which they returned. This hierarchical understanding of divine reality influenced the development of Christian angelology and Islamic discussions of divine names and attributes, demonstrating the continuing influence of Greek mythological themes in religious traditions that officially rejected polytheism. The psychological and spiritual insights embedded in mythological stories proved more durable than their literal theological claims. The transformation of classical culture under the influence of Christianity involved not simply the rejection of pagan religion, but complex processes of adaptation, reinterpretation, and synthesis that preserved many elements of Greek mythological wisdom within new theological frameworks. Christian apologists like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria argued that Greek philosophy and mythology contained partial truths that found their fulfillment in Christian revelation. The allegorical interpretation of mythology that had been developed by Stoic and Neoplatonic philosophers was adopted by Christian thinkers who found in classical stories prefigurations of Christian truths or moral lessons that remained valid despite their pagan origins. The story of Orpheus descending to rescue Eurydice was interpreted as a type of Christ's harrowing of hell, while the labors of Heracles were seen as examples of the struggle against vice that every Christian must undertake. This process of reinterpretation allowed classical learning to survive the transition to Christian culture, while ensuring that it served new religious purposes. Medieval universities preserved and transmitted Greek mythological texts not as religious documents, but as sources of moral instruction, historical information, and artistic inspiration that could enrich Christian culture without compromising Christian faith. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical mythology involved both scholarly recovery of ancient texts and creative reinterpretation of mythological themes in art, literature, and philosophy that reflected contemporary concerns and values. Humanist scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola found in Platonic and Neoplatonic interpretations of mythology sophisticated theological and philosophical systems that could complement rather than compete with Christian thought. Renaissance artists found in mythological subjects opportunities to explore themes of love, beauty, heroism, and divine inspiration that were more difficult to address within the constraints of purely Christian iconography. Botticelli's mythological paintings, Michelangelo's sculptures of pagan gods and heroes, and the elaborate allegorical programs of palace decorations throughout Europe demonstrated the continuing power of classical themes to inspire artistic creativity and express profound human aspirations. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries involved not simply the rejection of ancient authorities, but complex processes of reinterpretation that preserved valuable insights while discarding outdated cosmological and physical theories. The mathematical harmonies that Pythagoras and Plato had found in cosmic order continued to inspire scientists like Kepler and Newton, even as they developed new methods for investigating natural phenomena. The psychological insights embedded in mythological stories proved particularly durable, continuing to influence literature, art, and eventually psychology itself long after their cosmological and theological frameworks had been abandoned. Shakespeare's use of mythological themes, the Romantic movement's fascination with ancient wisdom, and the development of depth psychology all demonstrated the continuing relevance of insights first articulated in stories about gods and heroes. The modern study of mythology that developed during the 19th and 20th centuries involved both scholarly investigation of ancient sources and theoretical attempts to to understand the psychological and social functions that mythological thinking served in human culture. Anthropologists, psychologists, and historians of religion found in Greek mythology examples of universal patterns of human thought and experience that transcended specific cultural contexts. The comparative study of mythology revealed striking similarities between Greek stories and mythological traditions from cultures around the world, suggesting that certain themes and patterns reflected fundamental structures of human consciousness rather than merely local cultural developments. The hero's journey, the death and resurrection of divine figures, the conflict between order and chaos, and the search for immortality appeared in various forms across diverse cultural contexts. This recognition of universal mythological patterns influenced both scholarly understanding of human nature and popular culture's ongoing fascination with mythological themes. Joseph Campbell's work on the monomyth provided a framework for understanding how ancient stories could continue to provide meaning and guidance in modern contexts, while Jungian psychology offered therapeutic applications for mythological wisdom. The influence of Greek mythology on contemporary popular culture demonstrates its continuing relevance to human concerns that transcend historical periods and cultural boundaries. Movies, novels, video games, and other forms of entertainment regularly draw on mythological themes and characters that remain immediately recognizable and emotionally compelling to modern audiences. This popular engagement with mythological material often involves creative adaptation that preserves essential patterns while updating details to reflect contemporary values and concerns. Modern versions of mythological stories typically emphasize psychological realism, gender equality, and moral complexity in ways that ancient versions did not, while maintaining the basic narrative structures and character relationships that made the original stories compelling. The therapeutic applications of mythological wisdom that have developed within modern psychology and counseling reflect recognition that the stories retain their power to illuminate human experience and provide guidance for personal growth and healing. Therapists use mythological metaphors to help clients understand their own life patterns, while mythologically informed approaches to education seek to provide young people with cultural resources for making sense of their experiences and choices. The environmental movement has found particular inspiration in mythological traditions that emphasize the sacred nature of natural landscapes and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with divine forces embodied in rivers, forests, mountains, and other natural features. The ecological wisdom embedded in stories about nymphs, satyrs, and other nature deities offers alternatives to purely utilitarian approaches to environmental management. The feminist movement has engaged extensively with Greek mythology, both as a source of patriarchal attitudes that need to be critiqued, and as a repository of powerful female figures who can serve as models for contemporary women seeking to develop their own potential. Goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Demeter represent different approaches to feminine power and agency that remain relevant to modern discussions about gender roles and women's aspirations. The continuing relevance of Greek mythological wisdom lies not in its historical accuracy or literal truth claims, but in its sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social relationships, and the ongoing human quest for meaning and purpose in an often challenging and unpredictable world. The gods and heroes of ancient Greece continue to speak to universal aspects of human experience that remain constant across historical periods and cultural contexts. The stories of divine love and jealousy, creativity and destruction, wisdom and folly, justice and mercy address fundamental questions about what it means to be human that each generation must answer anew in light of its own circumstances and challenges. The mythological framework provides not dogmatic answers, but rich resources for reflection and inspiration that can inform contemporary choices while connecting modern people to the accumulated wisdom of previous generations. The artistic and literary traditions that have grown from Greek mythological sources demonstrate the continuing fertility of these ancient stories as sources of creative inspiration. Each generation of artists, writers, and thinkers has found new meanings and applications for traditional themes, while adding their own contributions to an ongoing cultural conversation that stretches back over thousands of years. The educational value of mythological literacy extends beyond familiarity with cultural references to encompass deeper understanding of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of human experience that are often neglected in purely technical or scientific approaches to learning. Students who encounter mythological stories gain access to sophisticated discussions of moral philosophy, political theory, and human psychology that remain relevant to contemporary challenges. The psychological sophistication of Greek mythology is perhaps most evident in its recognition that human nature contains contradictory impulses that cannot be simply resolved through rational analysis or moral exhortation, but must be acknowledged, understood, and integrated through ongoing personal work. The gods themselves embody these contradictions, showing both admirable and deplorable qualities that reflect the complexity of the forces that shape human behavior and social relationships. This psychological realism makes mythological stories more rather than less relevant to modern understanding of human nature, as contemporary psychology has confirmed many of the insights about personality dynamics, family relationships, and social behavior that were first articulated in stories about divine figures whose struggles mirror those of mortal beings. The recognition that even gods are imperfect and conflicted provides a more realistic foundation for human self-understanding than idealized moral teachings that ignore the reality of internal conflict and ambivalence. The continuing influence of Greek mythology on Western civilization demonstrates both the profound wisdom embedded in these ancient stories and their remarkable adaptability to changing historical circumstances and cultural values. Rather than representing a primitive stage of human thought that has been superseded by scientific rationality, mythology provides complementary ways of understanding human experience that address questions that purely rational approaches cannot adequately answer. The quest for meaning, purpose, and transcendence that drives much human behavior requires resources that go beyond empirical observation and logical analysis, though it need not contradict or ignore the insights provided by scientific investigation. Mythological wisdom offers metaphorical and symbolic frameworks for understanding dimensions of human experience that resist purely literal description, while providing guidance for living that remains practically relevant across diverse contexts and situations. The enduring power of these mythological narratives to shape human understanding reveals itself most clearly in their capacity to evolve and adapt, while maintaining essential core insights that speak to unchanging aspects of the human condition. Each historical period has found in Greek mythology the resources necessary to address its own particular challenges and concerns, while the stories themselves have been enriched and deepened through centuries of interpretation, adaptation, and creative reimagining that have expanded rather than diminished their relevance and applicability. The medieval period, despite its official rejection of pagan religion, preserved and transmitted mythological wisdom through allegorical interpretations that found in classical stories prefigurations of Christian truth or moral lessons that transcended their original religious contexts. The story of Pandora's box, for example, was interpreted as an allegory of the fall, while the labors of Heracles were seen as representing the Christian struggle against temptation and vice. These interpretations allowed classical learning to survive and flourish within Christian culture, while serving new theological and educational purposes. The Islamic world, through its preservation and transmission of Greek philosophical texts, maintained access to mythological wisdom that had been integrated with philosophical inquiry by Neoplatonic thinkers. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Averroes found in Greek mythology sophisticated discussions of metaphysical questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between unity and multiplicity, and the proper ordering of human societies that remained relevant to their own intellectual projects. The Renaissance recovery of classical texts involved not just scholarly reconstruction of ancient sources, but creative engagement with mythological themes that addressed contemporary concerns about human dignity, artistic inspiration, and the relationship between Christian faith and classical learning.